Have you ever stood at the very peak? Not of a mountain, but of an idea. The idea that you are untouchable. That the rules of physics, of morality, of simple human consequence, no longer apply to you. That you have ascended. I want to tell you a story about a man who reached that peak. A man who commanded legions, who draped himself in purple, who had the known world kneel and whisper into his ear that he was a god. The emperor's belief in his own divinity represents the ultimate human aspiration to transcend the messy, mortal coil, a fantasy of absolute autonomy where one's will is indistinguishable from the law of the universe. He did not merely think himself favored by the gods or their offspring, he became convinced he was the architect of reality itself, a sovereign whose pronouncements could alter the fabric of existence. This was not simple arrogance but a complete cosmological repositioning of the self. His words were not commands but creational acts, his anger was not an emotion but a natural disaster, his benevolence was not kindness but the sun breaking through clouds. Every ritual, every piece of iconography minted with his profile, every temple erected to his cult, was a brick in this towering, metaphysical edifice. His courtiers, his soldiers, the very city around him, became participants in a grand, continuous play where he was the only real actor, and all others were fleeting, semi-real props in the drama of his eternal reign. The illusion was total, a self-sustaining ecosystem of power where doubt was not just heresy but a fundamental failure of perception, a blindness to the new reality he had purportedly manifest. This grand illusion finds its devastating counterpoint not in a rival's empire or a god's thunderbolt from Olympus, but in the shocking vulgarity of his end, a death by strangulation in a bathtub. The contrast could not be more violently poetic. Here was a man who believed he commanded the elements, defeated by tepid water. A voice that dictated history, silenced by the tightening of a human, or perhaps his own, grip. A body anointed and adorned as sacred, found prone and lifeless on cold, utilitarian porcelain. The setting itself is a brutal mockery. The battlefield, the palace throne room, even the prison cell, these are stages for the falls of great men. The bathtub is a site of cleansing, of vulnerability, of private, animal maintenance. It is resolutely domestic, humble, and human. His demise there is not a tragedy in the classical sense, but a farce of cosmic proportions, a punchline delivered by the universe itself. It asserts, with terrible finality, that the physics of flesh and blood ultimately veto the fantasies of the mind, no matter how grandly conceived. The body, that inconvenient vessel he sought to deify, reasserted its mundane tyranny. Thirst, fatigue, the need to relax muscles, these base animal needs led the god-king to the scene of his humiliating uncreation. The power of this juxtaposition lies in its utter dismantling of pretense. It demonstrates that the illusion of ultimate power is not pierced by a greater power, but by the persistent, nagging return of the ordinary. The most intricate theological framework of divine right, constructed over decades through fear, propaganda, and victory, evaporates in the steam of a bathhouse. His godhood did not falter because people stopped believing, but because a lung required air and a windpipe collapsed. This is the core irony that echoes through history. Our attempts to become more than human are invariably undone by the insistent, non-negotiable conditions of being human. The emperor, in his final moments, was not wrestling with a usurper for control of an empire, but with the most fundamental struggle of any creature, the struggle for breath. In that primal fight, there are no gods, only organisms. His entire constructed identity, the titles, the terror, the worship, meant nothing in the face of that single, biological imperative. Thus, the first keynote is not merely a historical observation but a timeless principle about the architecture of hubris. It reveals that the peak of perceived power is often the precipice of a particularly steep fall into reality. The emperor's story is a parable written in the starkest ink, illustrating that the more elaborate the fantasy of transcendence, the more catastrophic and mundane its collapse will be. The bathtub stands as the eternal symbol of this reckoning, a reminder that every emperor, every would-be god, every individual who believes they have risen above the constraints of the common lot, is ultimately, intimately, and irrevocably tethered to a body that will, one day, demand its due in the most commonplace of ways. The throne room may be the stage for the performance of divinity, but the bathroom is often the dressing room where the costume is finally, forcibly removed, revealing the actor beneath, shivering and mortal, all illusion drained away with the water. The architecture of delusion is never a solitary construction, it is a communal project, built by the willing hands of those who find profit or survival in the shadows of a towering ego. The emperor who believes himself a god does not arrive at that conclusion in a vacuum, any more than a lone man could single-handedly erect a pyramid. His madness is carefully, methodically curated, brick by sycophantic brick, by the world he creates and which in turn creates him. It begins subtly, with the soft mortar of flattery, the comparison to past great leaders, the gentle suggestion of his exceptional wisdom, the applause that lasts a heartbeat too long. This escalates to the stonework of staged adulation, public rituals designed not to honor tradition but to isolate the ruler within a spectacle of his own centrality, where every gaze is a mirror reflecting back a distorted, grander image. The architecture grows more elaborate with the installation of yes-men, those courtiers and advisors whose sole function is to translate the emperor's every murmur into divine insight, and to filter out the grating noise of dissent, bad news, or simple reality. They become the soundproof walls of his expanding palace of the mind, ensuring that the only voice he hears is an echo of his own, now amplified and sanctified by their repetition. This structure is then reinforced with the cold, hard steel of fear, which is perhaps the most durable material in this grim architecture. The populace, and crucially, the inner circle, learn the lethal cost of questioning the new reality. A scoff, a skeptical glance, a piece of truthful but inconvenient data, these become capital crimes against the state religion, which is the emperor himself. Thus, fear performs a double duty: it exterminates doubt and manufactures consent. It teaches people not just to obey, but to perform their belief with fervent conviction. They offer sacrifices at his temples not from faith, but from a terrified understanding that their survival is tied to the vigor of their performance. The emperor, surrounded by these perfect, fear-fueled performances, receives constant, irrefutable evidence of his divinity. Is not the entire world bending its knee? Are not the oracles speaking in his favor? Is not the very air thick with the incense of his worship? The feedback loop is complete and inescapable. His whims become divine will, his paranoia becomes sacred prophecy, and his cruelty becomes the necessary purification of the realm. He lives inside a hall of mirrors where every reflection is a lie, but every lie is confirmed by 1,000 nodding heads. Within this prison of his own making, however, the emperor becomes its most trapped inmate. The architecture designed to elevate him actually immures him. He is severed from the nourishing, if sometimes bitter, sustenance of genuine human connection and unvarnished truth. He loses the capacity to trust, for how can a god trust the motives of mere mortals? He loses the ability to gauge real danger, for his informants tell him only of boundless love and lurking, easily crushed treason. He becomes alienated from the very human experiences that anchor sanity, friendship, challenge, empathy, laughter at one's own expense. His reality becomes a sterile, self-referential simulation, a tautological nightmare where he is God because everyone says he is, and everyone says he is because they are too terrified to say otherwise. The madness is no longer a personal failing but the inevitable environmental condition of his existence, like pressure building in a deep-sea dive. The air inside the prison is poison, but it is the only air he breathes. This process reveals the profound irony of absolute power: the more one seeks to control external reality, the more one loses control of one's internal grasp on it. The courtiers, the soldiers, the priests, they may think they are merely surviving, playing a dangerous game to maintain their status or their lives. But in their collective, terrified compliance, they are actively building the solitary confinement cell for their master. They give him a world made entirely of his own reflection, and in doing so, they take away the world itself. They leave him spiritually and intellectually starved, a captive of his own iconography, until the man inside the god suit is a hollow, paranoid, and profoundly isolated creature, reacting to phantoms and shadows while believing he commands the sun. The architecture is perfect, impenetrable, and utterly suffocating. It stands not as a monument to his glory, but as a meticulously crafted tomb for his humanity, long before his body meets its end. Every cheer from the crowd adds another lock to the door, every decree etched in stone is another bar on the window, every terrified whisper of his sacred name tightens the invisible straitjacket. He reigns from a throne that is, in its essential nature, a padded cell, decorated with gold and scarlet but denying him any contact with the weathering, healing, chaotic breeze of what is real. History, in its long and patient passage, operates not merely as a recorder but as a satirist of unparalleled wit, dispensing a form of justice so perfectly tailored to the folly it punishes that it feels less like happenstance and more like the punchline of a dark, cosmic joke. The emperor's demise in his bath is not a tragedy in the classical sense, it lacks the noble downfall, the clash of mighty forces, the cathartic purge of pity and fear. Instead, it arrives with the jarring, grotesque cadence of farce. This is history's ironic punishment, a rebuke written not in the language of morality but in the language of poetic incongruity. The instrument of his end is not the sword of a noble rival or the venom of a cunning plot, but the very essence of mundane comfort. Water, the source of life and cleanliness, becomes the agent of his silencing. The bath, a place of retreat and vulnerability, becomes the stage for his most public humiliation, a humiliation that echoes louder through the ages precisely because of its intimate, degrading absurdity. The universe, it seems, did not deign to strike him down with a thunderbolt, which would have at least conferred a kind of mythical legitimacy, a recognition of his challenge to the gods. Instead, it offered the bathtub. It is the ultimate dismissal, a reduction of world historical ambition to a domestic accident. The message is clear: your pretensions were so grand, your self-mythology so inflated, that only the most ludicrous and undignified collapse could properly serve as its counterweight. This irony extends beyond the mere circumstances of his death to infect the very memory he sought to eternalize. The mad emperor who wished to be remembered as a god is instead immortalized as a punchline. His name, which he intended to be whispered with awe, is now chuckled over in the company of other historical cautionary tales. The meticulous cult of personality, the temples, the coerced worship, all of it was labor in service of a legacy that has been permanently twisted into a symbol of hubris undone by the ordinary. He built for himself a mausoleum of legend, and history, with a sly grin, buried him in a bathroom. The punishment is thus eternal, playing out in the realm of reputation and historical judgment. He is not the fearsome deity of his own imagination, but a figure of pity and mockery, a man so lost in his own reflection that he drowned in a few inches of water. This is the curse of the ironic end, it forever colors the narrative that precedes it. His conquests, his laws, his grand constructions are all retrospectively viewed through the lens of the bathtub, tinted with the hue of impending, ridiculous doom. His life's work becomes a long, elaborate setup for a joke whose payoff is his strangled corpse. Furthermore, the irony is deepened by the sheer banality of the forces arrayed against him. He spent his life preparing for threats of epic scale, barbarian hordes, Senate conspiracies, divine displeasure. He fortified borders, purged elites, and performed sacrifices. Yet the reckoning came from a confluence of the utterly commonplace: fatigue from a journey, the warmth of water, the slickness of tile, the simple, mechanical fact of a hand applied to a throat. History's punchline demonstrates that the most complex and terrifying structures of power are perpetually vulnerable to the quiet, unheroic conspiracy of trivial realities. It is a lesson in the ultimate democracy of consequence. The emperor, who believed himself above all law, was finally subjected to the most universal laws of all, physics and physiology. His death was not an assassination but an anecdote, a grimly humorous footnote proving that gravity and asphyxiation are no respecters of persons. The universe, in its infinite jest, chose not a dramatic contest but a pratfall to illustrate the point, ensuring that the lesson would be unforgettable precisely because it is so embarrassingly undignified. This form of punishment is peculiarly resonant because it speaks to a deep human intuition about balance, about a universe that eventually restores a kind of equilibrium through ridicule. When a figure so violently offends against the natural order by declaring himself a god, the natural order does not respond with an equally grand, supernatural rebuttal. That would only validate the scale of his ambition. Instead, it responds with a deflating pinprick. It lets the air out of the grandiose illusion with a hiss, not a bang. The bathtub is that pinprick. It is the mundane reality that, after all the sound and fury, has the final, quiet word. The emperor's story thus becomes a parable etched in irony, a reminder that history's court often delivers its verdicts not with the solemnity of a judge, but with the devastating, clarifying laugh of a truth-teller who points out that the king is not only naked, but also prone, dripping, and very, very dead in a most unregal setting. His end is a cosmic joke where the setup is a lifetime of unparalleled arrogance and the payoff is a slip and a choke, leaving us with the chilling, laughter dying in our throats realization that the universe's sense of humor is both impeccable and terrifyingly merciless. The dusty parchment of this ancient tale crackles with a warning that is not confined to its era. It whispers across the centuries into the very architecture of our modern lives, where the temptation to construct private divinity persists, albeit in subtler, more insidious forms. The mad emperor's bathtub is not merely a relic but a mirror, and in its reflective, watery surface we are meant to see the distortions of our own time. For while we may not don the purple or demand animal sacrifice, the core dynamics that built his prison of self-worship, the intoxication of unchecked praise, the insulation from dissent, the separation from shared human frailty, are actively replicated in the boardrooms, the online echo chambers, the political stages, and even the curated realities of our personal ambitions. The emperor's fatal flaw was not his initial power, but his accelerating belief in his own exceptionalism, a belief meticulously cultivated by a system that rewarded agreement and punished contradiction. Do we not see this same architecture rising today? The modern leader, or indeed any individual atop a hierarchy, who is surrounded only by voices that amplify their genius and filter out the abrasive sand of criticism, is laying the same bricks. They may be made of glass and steel, of algorithms and approval metrics, but they form the same soundproof walls. The yes men have simply traded togas for tailored suits or sycophantic comments in a digital feed, their function unchanged, to affirm the ruler's reality, however detached it may become. This story, therefore, is a profound caution against the slow, soul-sundering separation from humanity that absolute power, or even the illusion of it, inevitably demands. The emperor ceased to see his subjects as people and saw them only as extensions of his will, as instruments or obstacles. His isolation was not just physical but empathetic. He lost the capacity to connect, to understand, to feel the common pulse of human need and fear. In our contemporary context, this separation manifests whenever a person of influence, be it a CEO, a cultural icon, or a political figure, begins to view the crowd not as a collection of individuals with hopes and limits, but as an abstract mass to be manipulated, a metric to be optimized, or a backdrop for their own narrative. It appears when the language of we permanently hardens into the declaration of I, when the lived experience of ordinary people becomes a data point rather than a truth to be felt. The bathtub's lesson is that this separation is not a luxury of power, it is its fatal disease. It severs the tether to reality, and without the tether, a dizzying and destructive ascent is guaranteed, followed by a catastrophic fall. The modern world, with its gated communities, private jets, and bespoke information streams, offers more tools than ever to engineer this very separation, to live in a bubble where one's own reflection is the only visage ever seen. Ultimately, the tale echoes as a warning about the universal and timeless vulnerability of the human ego to inflation. We are all, in our own smaller domains, susceptible to the whispers that we are special, that the rules are for others, that our success is solely a product of our inherent brilliance rather than a complex alchemy of effort, luck, and the contributions of others. The emperor is simply the most extreme case study of a pandemic human tendency. His story asks us to interrogate the thrones we build in our own minds, the professional identities we become intoxicated by, the personal brands we polish into irrefutable icons, the spheres of influence where we stop listening. It urges vigilance against the inner court of our own biases that constantly tells us we are right, we are exceptional, we are beyond critique. The strangled gasp in the bath is the sound of that inflated ego meeting the uncompromising surface of a hard, wet, real limit. For us, the confrontation may be less literal, but it is no less real, the failed venture born of unvetted arrogance, the collapsed relationship eroded by entitled behavior, the public disgrace following a long period of unaccountable action. These are our bathtubs, our moments of humiliating reconnection with a shared reality that does not care about our personal mythology. Thus, the ancient chronicle reaches into the present and grabs us by the collar. It is a plea for grounding, for the maintenance of honest relationships that dare to speak the word no, for the conscious pursuit of experiences that remind us of our common physical and emotional vulnerabilities. It is an argument for keeping one's feet, metaphorically and literally, on the common ground. The emperor's fate is the ultimate reminder that no tower of self-belief is so high that the pull of gravity ceases to apply. His drowning is a metaphor for any of us who, in swimming in the intoxicating waters of our own perceived greatness, forget that we too must breathe the same air as everyone else, that we are subject to the same fundamental laws, and that the most dangerous flood is often the one that rises from within, from the unchecked springs of our own delusion. The story endures because the thread is perennial. The mad emperor is not an outlier from a benighted past, but a shadow version of a possibility that exists in every human heart that has ever tasted power, however small, and momentarily wondered if it was proof of something divine.